Greetings. Our topic for this module is achieving quality excellence in services. As you can imagine, this is a very important topic. Services are becoming a major portion of the economy, and they are highly interactive. Customers directly interface with them all the time, and they are not shy about communicating what experience they had with the service. And with the rise of platforms on the internet, we are hearing more and more about customers' service experiences in various settings. This topic is also important for another major reason. One of the reasons we are seeing a rise in the service economy is people increasingly want and seek happiness, and they feel that they're not getting the happiness from gadgets, goods. And services end up being memorable experiences, which is why they seek them out. So it's all the more important that we give them what they want, which is happiness through excellent service. However, as we'll see in this module, happiness in services is not that easy to achieve and not even easy to define. So let's look at first, how do we define, measure, and achieve service quality? What are the different dimensions of service quality? How do we break it down? What does quality really mean? And then we'll talk about a model called the service quality gap model that researchers have come up with to diagnose quality problems and to improve service quality. And we'll also talk about some pragmatic techniques like benchmarking and mystery shopping or service audit. And we may briefly touch upon offering an unconditional service guarantee to assure a customer who's coming for the first time, and also preparing for service recovery, which means when we do make an error, how do we quickly recover? So these are the topics that we have in mind for this module. So let's first talk about service quality itself. Across a range of services, from salons and massage shops to high-end consulting services, professional services like in healthcare and legal services, defining quality itself tends to be very complicated, let alone achieving it. Quality in these service settings is dependent on a number of things. Clearly, it's dependent on the ambience, the supporting infrastructure, the facility. If the ambience is not good, people are not going to rate the service high. And the goods, the products, the offerings, the tangible part of the service is surely important. So let's say you go to a salon for a haircut. The quality of the haircut does indeed matter. But service quality is more than just the ambience and even the goods, the tangible part of the service that you receive. There's a huge psychological component to it. The service provider's demeanor. So if you're a service professional, how friendly you are, how responsive you are, how reassuring you are, all these are very important. And you can't help it all as well. The customer's state of mind matters as well. If they are in a state of stress, if they are depressed, or if they're a grumpy customer, you can't do much about it. So there is the customer's state of mind as a huge component. And the sensual benefits they get, some from the ambience, but also from other customers who are there, all that matters as well. And essentially the overall experience, the rapport, the friendliness established by the provider goes a long way into this. But the overall experience is what ultimately the customer cares about. And clearly, this is because of the highly interactive nature of services. And in fact, some recent research suggests that even in the case of doctors, a very highly skilled profession, the eventual performance of doctors depends more than their MCAT scores or their subject matter expertise, their personality traits, their attitude, and other interpersonal skills like empathy and friendliness are even most predictors of career success. So there is this article in the New York Times, January 2010, titled, doctor and patient, looking beyond MCATs to pick future success. Go ahead and Google that if you're interested in this topic, but you know what I mean. It's not just the tangible part of the service, the intangible parts, the friendliness and the rapport established by the service provider matters a lot. None of this is a surprise to you, but very often we underestimate how far this is important, and we think the tangible parts are what significantly impact service quality. Having agreed that service quality is a complicated thing to define, let's now talk about why it's also difficult to deliver and assure. So quality in services cannot be inspected beforehand, unlike in manufacturing. Let's say you're selling a car. You can produce the car and you can inspect it really thoroughly to make sure there are no defects before the customer gets it, like many of the high-end car companies do. Okay? Quality in the services is often assured during delivery. The service is produced when the customer is present in front. So we cannot really inspect it beforehand. And the customer itself is heavily involved in this service production and delivery process. It's a very dynamic, real-time process. So this is one of the major challenges, that we cannot inspect the service. We have to make sure defects don't appear, and if they do appear, we are able to recover very quickly. And oftentimes quality issues also happen because the customer is a cranky customer. It's a difficult customer. And how do we meet the needs of that in a very impromptu, spontaneous manner? How do we meet their expectations, their state of mind, which could be at the end of a stressful day, a busy day for them? All these need to be managed. Take the example of healthcare. So if a patient came in with an expectation to get a shot or a prescription or some latest medical test, which is not even required based on their current condition, a skillful doctor must somehow navigate this delicately. They cannot just dismiss the patient out of hand. The doctor needs to manage the expectation, communicate proactively, tell them why this test may actually be a counterproductive thing for the patient, and really help find an amicable solution. Also, customers can perceive quality very differently. Sometimes the quality that was offered to them is not even communicated. They don't really understand the impact of the difficulty of a procedure that was done to them. So communication plays a big role as well. So one way to think about service quality is as a gap between the expectations with which customers come into a service and the perceptions at the end of the service delivery. Okay? So a customer's satisfaction can be defined as this gap between perception at the end of the process and the expectation coming into the process. So if the perception at the end of the process is greater than the expectation, we have a satisfied or a highly satisfied customer. On the other hand, if they came in with high expectations and we did not meet those expectations, if the perceptions were below expectations, we have a disappointed customer. So we'll come back to this perception-expectation gap. Let's talk about the service quality at a broader level. Are there some major dimensions, of service quality that customers are expecting in many different service settings? There seem to be several. So first of all, assurance. So they want a level of confidence and trust with the service provider, that the service provider really is capable and has the customer's best interest at heart. They're not about to rip the customer off. So the service provider has to display competence, skill, and also alignment of incentives. They are here to help the customer, make the customer satisfied, get the customer the best service. Okay? So technical skill matters in this area for sure, but it also needs to be communicated. So the customer gets the impression that the provider is skillful, dependable, precise, accurate, etc. A second major dimension is responsiveness. How willing and how quick and how prompt are you in responding to the customer's need? One of the most annoying things for customers is coming into a service facility and they are kept waiting when the service providers seem to be not really busy. They're doing something on the computer and the customer doesn't understand what, and customers are waiting. They could be patients in a medical setting, they could be in a massage shop or a restaurant. So this responsiveness of the service facility is the second major dimension. And a broader skill even is empathy, which is the ability to be approachable, caring, understanding, able to relate to the customer's needs, especially when a defect or an error happened in the service delivery and customers are not happy with the way they receive the service. Now, the art of service recovery requires empathy from the service provider and the service innovator. We need to be good listeners. We need to display understanding of the customer's plight. We do need to get a good understanding of the customer situation and respond promptly and in a skillful manner, in a correct manner. So assurance, responsiveness, empathy are three major dimensions of service quality. So we can actually get a little bit more precise about this notion of service quality, and one of the ways we think about service quality is customer satisfaction, because services are all about customers. So one way we measure service quality is the satisfaction of customers who go through this service setting, and increasingly service companies are measured on their customer satisfaction. Some of the companies get very high scores, while others, for example, broadband internet companies, rank very low in customer satisfaction. Okay? So typically, customers are asked a question on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, how satisfied are you? Would you recommend this to your friends, to other prospective customers? So that's how customer satisfaction is measured. Okay? But how are people rating this customer satisfaction? What underlies this decision? So one way to think about this customer satisfaction is it's probably the gap between the customer's expectation coming into the service setting and their perception after receiving the service. Okay? So customer satisfaction is perception minus expectation, the differential. So if their perception exceeds the expectation, we do have a satisfied customer. And if not, we have a dissatisfied customer. And the magic of customer satisfaction is about closing the gap if expectations were higher than perception and making sure that we get a positive gap. So we have a highly satisfied, a delighted customer. Okay, so that's fine. Now, how do we think about this gap more deeply? Okay, so what underlies this gap? Why does this gap arise in practice? So that's what we're going to talk about. But just to put this in a broader setting, the service profit chain concept that you may have come across, it talks about how profitability of any service setting is very dependent on loyal customers, because loyal customers are the way you grow and you make money. And customer loyalty really depends on customer satisfaction. If you do not have satisfied customers, they're not going to be loyal. So customer satisfaction is often a necessary condition for customer loyalty. It's not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition. And customer satisfaction depends on the gaps that we're going to talk about, and also the employee satisfaction. Employees themselves need to be treated well, need to be satisfied, So that has a bearing on customer satisfaction as well. So let's make sure we don't ignore that. So customer satisfaction is two things. One is the direct act of satisfying the customer by closing the various gaps that we'll talk about in just a minute. But there is also the internal service quality, which is the satisfaction levels, the morale levels of the employees, which results in their greater productivity and greater retention, and which translates into better skilled workers, more empathic workers, and who deliver a service that is perceived to be high value leading to customer satisfaction. So this is the concept of the service profit chain. So bottom line, customer satisfaction has two angles to it. There is the employee satisfaction, which is important as well, and then the customer satisfaction. So now let's look at the concept of customer satisfaction itself. Clearly, it's all very perception-driven in services because services are intangible. Unlike a product, like a car, we can measure how often it breaks down over a 3, 4, 5-year period. We don't have such concrete, hard measures of quality in services. So perceived service quality is really the gap between perception and expectation. Expectation is what customers are expecting coming into a service, and it's often shaped by what their personal needs are, what their past experience with this particular service provider is, and word of mouth, what they have heard from their friends and social network, family networks, and others on the internet. So all these shape the expectation that people come into the service with, right? And now on the other side, when they go through the process, they have a certain experience, which is their perceived service, PS. And the service quality assessment is really the gap between this ES and PS. So when PS exceeds ES, we have a satisfied, even delighted customer. And when it does not, or when expectations were more than the perception at the end of the service, we have a dissatisfied customer to deal with, okay? So what might result in a gap? When might a customer be disappointed? How do we make sure that does not happen? Can we do something in a planning sense? So that's where what's called a service quality gap framework comes in. This is from literature in this area, research literature in this area. Some scholars, Parashuraman, Zaitamal, and colleagues came up with this model called the ServQual model. And that's what it's technically called, but think of it as quality gap. So it says basically the gap between a customer's perception and expectation can be broken down into several other gaps, more actionable gaps. Yes, indeed, the eventual outcome that we want to achieve is to close the gap between customer perceptions and expectations, the gap 5, as it is called in the slide. But the way we're going to get there is by closing the other gaps, gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So gap 5 is a function of gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we can do something to close. And by doing so, we get a satisfied customer. So that's the idea here. So let's talk about each of these gaps one at a time, gaps 1 through 4. So gap 1 is really the gap between customer expectation and the enterprise's perceptions of the customer expectation. Management or the founding team or the innovator or the service professional, how they perceive customer expectation from what the customer really wanted, okay? So this is the understanding of the customer, sharper market research. So how much quality do customers want in a particular service? So this can be a huge source of opportunity. For too long, coffee companies thought all customers cared about was price, So sell coffee for 50 cents or 75 cents, and you got a customer. But along came Starbucks that understood that customers are willing to pay a better quality experience. Good coffee delivered in a very nice setting, with good aroma, nice, ambience, and, the cups are good quality. So everything about the setting was nice. And so Starbucks really built a huge enterprise by its better understanding of the customer needs, that people are willing to pay for a better experience in a coffee shop. So this is the first gap. How do we understand what the customer really wants? And what are the customer's expectations coming in? And how are these expectations formed? How do they form these expectations? By advertising, or is it by communication with friends, or past visits? So that's really how this gap arises. If there is a gap, it's because we don't understand how these expectations are formed and what these expectations are really. And the way we close this gap is by getting good at market research, better, sharper market research, where we have a deeper understanding of the customer's needs. Sometimes these are latent, hidden, unarticulated needs. They're not going to tell you that they're willing to pay a lot more for a good cup of coffee. It's something we need to understand very implicitly. That's the genius of innovation, really being able to understand these tacit needs, unarticulated needs. So that's about closing gap one. So gap one is translation of the customer's needs, expectations, and really capturing them, understanding them. Now comes gap two. We may understand the customer's needs, but now we need to turn them into specifications, design specifications. So this is what's called the design gap or the specification gap. So this gap often arises because the firm is unable to formulate, define, design a service to meet customer expectations, even if it is understood well. So the firm may know that the customer really wants high quality, but they don't know how to deliver it at the price point that they are expecting. So that may be a viability issue, or it may be a design skill issue. They just lack the skill, design skill or imagination to come up with a service, to design a service that meets the customer's expectations. So how do we close this gap? We'll have to think about this, but a couple of quick points here. We have to really expand the horizons. We have to think outside the box, get ideas from other industries and how they have done it. We have to be really creative in order to close this gap. Okay. Next comes gap three. Gap three is the gap between the design specifications and the delivery. Okay. So here, a gap arises because the actual service delivered does not meet the design specification. It may be because one individual employee in a coffee shop in some corner of the country is not delivering what he or she was supposed to do. Okay? So this is a production gap that happens in the field, maybe because employees lack the skills, they were selected wrongly, or they are improperly trained, or there's not enough teamwork. Okay, so clearly the way we close this gap by addressing each of these issues, we train them, and we also foster more teamwork, have incentives that pay people based on teamwork, incentives to close this gap, essentially. So those are the first three gaps. Okay, from gap 1, 2, 3 to now gap 4, which is the communication gap. Oftentimes, the service delivered itself is not bad, but the customer doesn't perceive it quite as well. Maybe they are busy with other things. They just don't notice the high quality of service that was delivered to them. So customers just not aware of what they got. So how do we close this? We have to do something to make sure that they understand. We materialize the service, as it's called. You may have noticed that when you go to certain hotels, you may have gone out somewhere and then you come back and the hotel employees have done the bed, have cleaned the room and done the bed. And you may not notice it that they have done it. So what do? How do they make sure that you notice it? They leave some goodies, maybe a piece of chocolate there. And that signals to you that they were there to take care of the room. So that's an example of materializing the service to close the communication gap. So the next time you see a goodie, a chocolate, think about this gap and our discussion here about service quality. And the final gap is, of course, the gap that we are most interested in, which is the gap between the customer expectation and the perception, and eventual customer satisfaction depends on closing this gap, which this model argues depends on the other 4 gaps. So gap 5 is a function of gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if we want to minimize gap 5 or create a positive gap, make sure perception exceeds expectation. So that's what we are interested in. Either we want to minimize the negative gap or maximize the positive gap. Okay. Some might say, can we just lower expectation? So can we beat the game? Can we achieve customer satisfaction? Well, think about it. In a competitive market, you can't lower the expectations too much because then, other competitors will take the customers away. So the expectation game will only go so far. So we have to really improve the delivery and the communication and all these gaps that we have talked about so far. Okay, a couple of other concepts around this. So in the service management area, there are two terms that you want to be familiar with. One is called the moment of truth. And this is a term popularized by the European airline company SAS, and actually comes from a Spanish word concept in bullfighting. Apparently, a moment of truth is a point where the matador is about to kill the bull. And we have borrowed this terminology in services. The moment of truth is where the service professional or the service firm is put to test. You have a challenging customer situation, and we have to deliver on it. And this is often where challenges arise. An airline loses a bag or a violin or something important to the customer, and the customer is really mad. How are we going to respond to that? This is the moment of truth. And oftentimes, we can't do much except recover from this. So this is the term of service recovery, which is satisfying a previously dissatisfied customer so that they become your loyal customer. So treat them royally so that they become a loyal customer. So they'll keep coming back. So explain to them what happened and why it happened and how sorry you are and what can you do about that. The next flight will bring your stuff. You have to do everything possible at the moment of truth to really get a service recovery. Okay. What are some practical methods that we have for achieving service quality and closing the gaps, for example? One is the term or concept of benchmarking, which means comparing our performance with other peers who are known for being the best in class, who everybody thinks is really good. And, the point is simple. Imitation is often the fastest form of progress. So if somebody else is figured out, we can close the gap by just imitating them. And so that's the power of benchmarking. A lot of companies have tried it because it gives good return on investment. But there may be limits to benchmarking. So what works for one setting may not work in another setting. So especially if the customers are very different. So take, for example, even a company like Walmart versus Costco. They both look kind of similar, right? They sell goods at a very budget price, very low margins, but they have very different type of customers. You might know that Costco has far more affluent customers. If you go to any Costco, the parking lots are full of BMWs and Mercedeses, right? And these customers are, cost conscious, but they also expect a higher level of service. So Costco may not just simply benchmark against Walmart and do just what Walmart is doing. That's why Costco pays its employees more, gives them more benefits. It has a better level of service like no questions, returns. So, you have to make sure the service you're offering caters to your customer segment. But benchmarking is a practical tool to keep in mind. Within these limits, benchmarking does have lots of potential. Another very practical approach for improving service quality is a walkthrough audit, especially done as a mystery shopper. Okay, so let's say you own a service facility or a service company, and you want to know how it's performing, how customers are feeling about the service. Of course, you can do surveys of the customers, and Like with most surveys, they may not return surveys and they may not give you the truth. Alternately, you go as a mystery customer, you disguise as a customer and go in and consume the service, or you send another person, hire another person, send them as a mystery shopper. So a mystery shopper is really a secret customer whose identity as the auditor of the facility is not revealed to the employees. The mystery shopper indulges in a range of activities like asking questions, walking the aisles of the service facility, and eventually purchasing the product, and reports on this entire customer experience from beginning to end. And if you hire an external consultant to do it, they could do a flow chart of the customer interaction with the mystery shopper. And they may also do some comparisons with peers along the various gaps to understand strengths and weaknesses. So for many firms, mystery shopping can be an eye-opening experience, not that expensive to do. So let's say you end up owning a service company, I would encourage that you try mystery shopping. It can be very valuable. It can also give new ideas for expanding your service as well. Okay, let's now talk briefly about service recovery. As mentioned earlier, service recovery is the act of recovering from a negative service experience. And this is important in the age of the internet because it's very easy for customers to report about that positive as well as negative service experiences. And these negative reviews through sites like Yelp can be very damaging to a growing enterprise, may not be able to attract new customers. However, if the service enterprise responds swiftly, it can recover and it can win back these unhappy customers. And some of these customers actually end up going and reporting on Yelp about how this company or enterprise made up. And this can attract new customers. In fact, some studies show that about 60% of the complaining customers would actually stay if their problem was resolved. And 95% say that they would stay if the problem was resolved quickly. So that underscores the need for prompt, quick service recovery. So the art of service recovery is acting promptly, listening intently, carefully, implementing a case-driven action that is tailored to this customer, takes care of their need, but also making it a systematic response within the enterprise so that such an error does not happen again, or at least not as frequently. And don't just engage in cheap talk, because people are increasingly tired of cheap talk. So this is where some companies offer platitudes without really doing anything. So in order to have a really satisfied customer, we need to show that we will pay the price for an error. Perhaps a voucher for a future service on a less busy day, like a Wednesday. So when we may have spare capacity and we can accommodate the customer. So we need to show that we really care about the customer and the fact that they had a bad experience. So that's the art of service recovery. In a nutshell, service quality and improving service quality are vital topics for service enterprises. So if you're going to participate in the service economy, you need to understand what service quality really means. What are the major dimensions? Assurance, responsiveness, empathy, and the service quality gap framework, which defines customer satisfaction as the gap between expected service coming into a service and perceived service when the customer leaves the service. And the overall gap is a function of 4 other gaps: the market research gap, the design gap, the conformance gap, and the communications gap. And the way we make sure that we have a good service is by closing all these gaps. Make sure we understand the customer needs correctly. We translate that into design specifications. Make sure the employees are trained to deliver the service correctly. And finally, we communicate the service that is delivered effectively. And despite doing all of that, there are going to be problems in achieving and improving service quality. So there are some practical techniques like benchmarking and mystery shopping, walk-through service audits. And we can also look at service recovery, acting promptly, and making sure that customers indeed appreciate the service that we give it to them.